Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Here is the first of the many adventures of the Hardy Boys, a series of books that is in many ways a companion series to the Nancy Drew books. For one thing, both series of books were produced by the same book packaging company, the Stratemeyer Syndicate. Here we meet Frank and Joe Hardy, the sons of the famous detective Fenton Hardy. The boys want very much to become well-known and accomplished detectives, just like their father. Surprisingly, a mystery seems to fall right in their laps, as they are first almost hit by a speeding car, and then they discover that their friend's automobile has been stolen by the same fanatic driver. Here is the first episode of The Tower Treasure, featuring the Hardy Boys. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Hardy Boys in The Tower Treasure by Franklin W. Dixon. Chapter 1. The Speed Demon. After the help we gave Dad on that forgery case, I guess he'll begin to think we could be detectives when we grow up. And why shouldn't we? Isn't he one of the most famous detectives in the country? And aren't we his sons? If the profession was good enough for him to follow, it should be good enough for us. Two bright-eyed boys on motorcycles were speeding along a shore road in the sunshine of a beautiful morning in spring. It was Saturday, and they were enjoying a holiday from the Bayport High School. The day was ideal for a motorcycle trip, and the lads were combining business with pleasure by going on an errand to a nearby village for their father. The older of the two boys was a tall, dark youth about 16 years of age. His name was Frank Hardy. The other boy, his companion on the motorcycle trip, was his brother Joe, a year younger. While there was a certain resemblance between the two lads, chiefly in the firm yet good-humored expression of their mouths, in some respects they differed greatly in appearance. While Frank was dark, with straight black hair and brown eyes, his brother was pink-cheeked, with fair curly hair and blue eyes. These were the Hardy Boys, sons of Fenton Hardy, an internationally famous detective who had made a name for himself in the years he had spent on the New York police force, and who was now, at the age of 40, handling his own practice. The Hardy family lived in Bayport, a city of about 50,000 inhabitants, located on Barmet Bay, 3 miles in from the Atlantic. And here the Hardy Boys attended high school and dreamed of the days when they, too, should be detectives like their father. As they sped along the narrow shore road, with the waves breaking on the rocks far below, they discussed their chances of winning over their parents to agreement with their ambition to follow in the footsteps of their father. Like most boys, they speculated frequently on the occupation they should follow when they grew up, and it had always seemed to them that nothing offered so many possibilities of adventure and excitement as the career of a detective. "But whenever we mention it to Dad, he just laughs at us," said Joe Hardy. "Tells us to wait until we're through school, and then we can think about being detectives." "Well, at least he's more encouraging than Mother," remarked Frank. "She comes out plump and plain and says she wants one of us to be a doctor and the other a lawyer." "Ha! What a fine lawyer either of us would make," sniffed Joe, "or a doctor either. We're both cut out to be detectives, and Dad knows it." "As I was saying, the help we gave him in that forgery case proves it. He didn't say much, but I'll bet he's been thinking a lot. Of course, We didn't actually do very much in that case, Joe pointed out. But we suggested something that led to a clue, didn't we? That's as much a part of detective work as anything else. Dad himself admitted he would never have thought of examining the city tax receipts for that forged signature. It was just a lucky idea on our part, but it proved to him that we can use our heads for something more than to hang our hats on. Oh, I guess he's convinced, all right. Once we get out of school, he'll probably give us his permission. Why, this is a good sign right now, isn't it? He asked us to deliver these papers for him in Willowville. He's letting us help him. I'd rather get in on a real good mystery, said Frank. It's all right to help Dad, but if there's no more excitement in it than delivering papers, I'd rather start in studying to be a lawyer and be done with it. Ah, never mind, Frank, comforted his brother. We may get a mystery all of our own to solve some day. If we do, we'll show that Fenton Hardy's sons are worthy of his name. Oh, boy, but what wouldn't I give to be as famous as Dad? Why, some of the biggest cases in the country are turned over to him. That forgery case, for instance. $50,000 had been stolen right from under the noses of the city officials, and all the auditors and city detectives and private detectives they called in had to admit that it was too deep for them. Then they called in Dad, and he cleared it up in 3 days. Once he got suspicious of that slick bookkeeper, whom nobody had been suspecting at all. It was all over but the shouting. Got a confession out of him and everything. It was smooth work. I'm glad our suggestion helped him. The case certainly got a lot of attention in the papers. And here we are, said Joe, plugging along the shore road on a measly little errand to deliver some legal papers at Willowville. I'd rather be on the track of some diamond thieves or smugglers or something. Well, we have to be satisfied, I suppose, replied Frank, leaning farther over the handlebars. Perhaps Dad may give us a chance on a real case sometime. Sometime? I want to be on a real case now. The motorcycles roared along the narrow road that skirted the bay. An embankment of tumbled rocks and boulders sloped steeply to the water below, and on the other side of the road was a steep cliff. The roadway itself was narrow, although it was wide enough to permit 2 cars to meet and pass, and it wound about in frequent curves and turnings. It was a road that was not often traveled, for Willowville was only a small village, and this shore road was an offshoot of the main highways to the north and west. The Hardy boys dropped their discussion of the probability that someday they would become detectives, and for a while they rode on in silence, occupied with the difficulties of keeping to the road. For the road at this point was dangerous, very rough and rutty, and it sloped sharply upward, so that the embankment leading to the ocean far below became steeper and steeper. I shouldn't want to go over the edge around here, remarked Frank, as he glanced down the rugged slope. It's 100-foot drop. You'd be smashed to pieces before you ever hit the shore. I'll say, it's best to stay in close to the cliff. These curves are bad medicine. The motorcycles took the next curve neatly, and then the boys confronted a long, steep slope. The rocky cliffs frowned on one side, and the embankment jutted far down to the tumbling waves below, so that the road was a mere ribbon before them. Once we get to the top of that hill, we'll be all right. It's all smooth sailing from there to Willowville, remarked Frank, as the motorcycles commenced the climb. Just then, above the sharp put-put of their own motors, they heard the high humming roar of an automobile approaching at great speed. The car was not yet in sight, but there was no mistaking the fact that it was coursing along with the cutout open and with no regard for the speed laws. "What idiot is driving like that on this kind of road?" exclaimed Frank. They looked back. Even as he spoke, the automobile flashed into sight. It came around the curve behind, and so swiftly did the driver take the dangerous turn that 2 wheels were off the ground as the car shot into view. A cloud of dust and stones arose. The car veered violently from left to right, and then it roared at headlong speed down the slope. The boys glimpsed a tense figure at the wheel. How he kept the car on the road was a miracle, for the racing automobile swung from side to side. At one moment, it would be in imminent danger of crashing over the embankment, down on the rocks below. The next instant, the car would be over on the other side of the road, grazing the cliff. "He'll run us down!" shouted Joe in alarm. "The idiot!" Indeed, the position of the 2 lads was perilous. The roadway was narrow enough at any time, and this speeding car was taking up every inch of space. In a great cloud of dust, it bore directly down on the 2 motorcyclists. It seemed to leap through the air. The front wheels left a rut. The rear of the car skidded violently about. By a twist of the wheel, the driver pulled the car back into the roadway again, just as it seemed about to plunge over the embankment. It shot over toward the cliff, swerved back again into the middle of the roadway, and then shot ahead at terrific speed. Frank and Joe edged their motorcycles as far to the right of the road as they dared. To their horror, they saw that the car was skidding again. The driver made no attempt to slacken speed. The automobile came hurtling toward them. Chapter 2. The Stolen Roadster. The auto brake squealed. The driver of the oncoming car swung the wheel viciously about. For a moment, it appeared that the wheels would not respond. Then they gripped the gravel, and the automobile swerved, then shot past. Bits of sand and gravel were flung about the 2 boys as they crouched by their motorcycles at the edge of the embankment. The car had missed them only by inches. Frank caught a glimpse of the driver, who turned about at that moment, and in spite of the speed at which the automobile was traveling, and in spite of the perils of the road, shouted something they could not catch at them, and shook his fist. The car was traveling at too great a speed to enable the lad to distinguish the driver's features, but he saw that the man was hatless, and that he had a shock of red hair blowing in the wind. Then the automobile disappeared from sight around the curve ahead, roaring away in a cloud of dust. "Ah, the road hog!" gasped Joe as soon as he had recovered from his surprise. "He must be crazy!" Frank exclaimed angrily. "Why, he might have pushed us both right over the embankment. At the rate he was going, I don't think he cared whether he ran anyone down or not." Both boys were justifiably angry. On such a narrow, treacherous road, there was danger enough when an automobile passed them traveling at even a reasonable speed. But the reckless and insane driving of that red-headed motorist was nothing short of criminal. "If we ever catch up to him, I'm going to give him a piece of my mind," declared Frank. "Not content with almost running us down, he had to shake his fist at us." "That road hog," muttered Joe again. "Jail is too good for the likes of him. If it was only his own life he endangered, it wouldn't be so bad. Good thing we only had motorcycles. If we'd been in another car, there would have been a smash-up for sure." The boys resumed their journey, and by the time they had reached the curve ahead that enabled them to see the village of Willowville, lying in a little valley along the bay beneath them, there was no trace of the reckless motorist. Frank delivered the legal papers his father had given to him, and then the boys had the rest of the day to themselves. "It's too early to go back to Bayport just now," he said to Joe. "What say we go out and visit Chet Morton?" "Good idea," agreed Joe. "He's often asked us to come out and see him." Chet Morton was a school chum of the Hardy boys. His father was a real estate dealer with an office in Bayport, but the family lived in the country, about a mile from the city. Although Willowville was some distance away, the boys knew of a road that would take them across country to the Morton home, and from there they could return to Bayport. It would make their journey longer, but they would have the pleasure of visiting their chum. Chet was a great favorite with all the boys, not the least of the reasons for his popularity being the fact that he had a roadster of his own, in which he drove to school every day, and with which he was very generous in giving rides to his friends after school hours. The Hardy boys drove along the country roads in the spring sunlight, enjoying the freedom of their holiday as only boys can. When they had reached a culvert not far from the Morton place, Frank suddenly brought his motorcycle to a stop and peered down into a clump of bushes in the deep ditch. "Somebody's had a spill," he remarked. Down in the bushes lay an upturned automobile. The car was a total wreck and lay bottom upward, a mass of tangled junk. "Must have been hitting an awful clip to crumple up like that," Joe commented. "Perhaps there's someone underneath. Let's go and see." The boys left their motorcycles by the road and went down to the wrecked car. But there was no sign of either driver or passengers. "If anyone was hurt, they've been taken away by now. Probably this wreck is a day or so old," said Frank. "Let's go. We can't do any good here." They left the wreckage and returned to the road again, resuming their journey. "I thought at first it might be our red-headed speed fiend," said Frank. "If it was, he was sure lucky to get out of it alive." The boys gave little further thought to the incident, and before long they were in sight of the Morton house, a big, home-like, rambling old farmhouse with an apple orchard at the rear. When the boys drove down the lane, they saw a figure awaiting them at the barnyard gate. "Ha! That's Chet," said Frank. "I'm glad we found him at home. I thought he might have gone out in the car." "It is strange," Joe agreed. "On a holiday like this, he doesn't usually stay around the farm." As they approached, they saw Chet leave the gate and come down the lane to meet them. Chet was one of the most popular boys at Bayport High School. One reason for his popularity being his unfailing good nature and his ability to see fun in almost anything. He was full of jokes and good humor, and was rarely seen without a smile on his plump, freckled face. But today, the Hardy boys saw that there was something wrong. Chet's face had an anxious expression, and as they brought their motorcycles to a stop, they saw that their chum's usually cheery face was clouded. "What's the matter?" asked Frank, as their friend hastened up to them. "You're just in time," replied Chet hurriedly. "You didn't meet a fellow driving my roadster, did you?" The brothers looked at each other blankly. "Your roadster? We'd recognize it anywhere." "No, we didn't," said Joe. "What's happened?" "It's been stolen." "Stolen?" "An auto thief stole it from the garage not half an hour ago. He just went in as cool as you please and made away with the car. The hired man saw the roadster disappearing down the lane, but he supposed I was in it, so he didn't think anything of it. Then he saw me out in the yard a little while later, so he got suspicious. And the roadster was gone." "Wasn't it locked?" "That's the strangest part of it. The car was locked, although the garage door was open. I can't see how he got away with it." "A professional job," commented Frank. "These auto thieves always carry scores of keys with them. But we're losing time here. The only thing is to set out in pursuit and notify the police. The hired man didn't see which way the fellow went, did he?" "No. There is only the one road, and we didn't meet him, so he must have taken the turning to the right at the end of the lane." "We'll chase him," said Joe. "Climb onto my bike, Chet. We'll get the thief yet." "Wait a minute," cried Frank suddenly. "I have an idea. Joe, do you remember that car we saw wrecked in the bushes?" "Well, sure." "Perhaps the driver stole the first automobile he could lay his hands on after that wreck." "What wreck was that?" asked Chet. The Hardy boys told him of the wrecked car they had found by the roadside. It had occurred to Frank that perhaps the smash-up might have occurred just a short while before, and that the driver of the wrecked car had resumed his interrupted journey in a stolen automobile. "It sounds reasonable," said Chet. "Let's go and take a look at this wreck. We can get the license number, and that may help us find the name of the owner." The motorcycles roared as the three chums set out, back along the road toward the place where the upturned automobile had been seen among the bushes. The boys lost no time in reaching the place, for they realized that every second was precious, and that the longer they delayed, the greater was the advantage to the car thief. The car had not been disturbed, and apparently no one had been near it since the boys had discovered the wreck. They parked their motorcycles by the roadside, and again went down into the bushes to examine the wrecked car. To their disappointment, the car bore no license plates. "That looks suspicious," said Frank. "It's more than suspicious," said Joe, who had withdrawn a little to one side and was examining the automobile from the rear. "Don't you remember seeing this car before, Frank? It didn't occur to me until you mentioned the matter of license plates." "I have been wondering if this isn't the same car that passed us on the shore road at the curve," replied Frank slowly. "It is the same car. There's no doubt of it in my mind. It didn't have a license plate. I noticed at the time, for I wanted to get the fellow's number, and it was a touring car of the same make as this." "You're right, Joe. There's no mistake. The red-headed driver came to grief in the ditch, just as we said he would. And then he went on to the nearest farmhouse, which happened to be Chet's place, and stole the first car he saw. The busted car was the one the fellow was running, who nearly sent us over the cliff," Joe declared. "And it's 10 chances to 1 he's the fellow who stole Chet's roadster. And he's red-headed. We have those clues anyway." "And he went on past our farmhouse instead of turning back the way he came," cried Chet. "Come on, fellows. Let's get after him. There was only a little bit of gas in the roadster anyway. Perhaps he's stalled by this time." Thrilling with the excitement of a chase, the boys clambered back onto the motorcycles, and within a few moments a cloud of dust rose from the road as the Hardy boys and Chet Morton set out in swift pursuit of the red-headed automobile thief. Chapter 3. Traces of the Thief. Chet Morton's roadster was a brilliant yellow, not easily mistaken, and the Hardy boys were confident that it would not be difficult to pick up the trail of the auto thief. "The car is pretty well known around Bayport," said Chet. "It was certainly a bright-looking speed wagon. Anyone who saw it would remember it." "It seems strange that a thief would take a car like that," remarked Frank. "Auto thieves usually take cars of a standard make and standard color. They're easier to get rid of. He would know that a car like yours could be easily traced." "I don't think he stole the car to sell it," Joe pointed out. "Take it from me, that chap was getting away from some place in a hurry, and when his own car was smashed, he just took the first one that came to hand. If we keep after him before he has a chance to get rid of it, we'll run him to earth." A number of men in a hayfield nearby attracted Frank's attention, and he brought his motorcycle to a stop. "I'm going to ask those chaps if they saw him pass." Frank scrambled over the fence and went over to talk to the farmhands, who watched his approach with curiosity. "Didn't see a yellow roadster pass here within the last hour, did you?" One of them, a lanky old farmer with a sunburned nose, carefully laid down his scythe. He put his hand to his ear and shouted, "Eh, what?" "Did you see a fellow pass along here in a roadster?" Frank repeated in a louder tone. The farmer turned to his companions, removed a plug of tobacco from the pocket of his overalls, and took a hearty chew. "Lad here wants to know if we saw a roadster come by here," he said slowly. There were 3 other farmhands, and all gathered around. They put down their scythes very deliberately, and the plug of tobacco was duly passed around the group. Frank waited. "A roadster, eh?" asked one. "A yellow roadster," Frank told him. One of the men removed his hat and mopped his brow. "Seems to me," he observed, "I did see a car come by here a while ago." "A yellow car?" "No, 'twa'n't a yellow car. It was a delivery truck, if I remember rightly." Frank strove to conceal his impatience. "It was a roadster I was asking about. A yellow roadster." "Not one of them there coupes, hey?" asked the oldest man in the group doubtfully. "No, not a coupe. A roadster." "Roadster, eh?" remarked the old farmer. "That's one of them there automobiles with just 2 seats and a little cupboard in the back, eh?" "My cousin has one," observed another member of the group. "He got it second-hand in Bayport. I never could see why he bought the doggone thing, for you can't take the folks out for a ride in it without having 'em all crowded something fearful. Give me the old touring car every time." "Can't say as I agree with you," returned the old farmer. "What good's a touring car if you want to haul a load of grain into town? One of them little trucks is the best, I've always thought. Then if you want to go on a picnic or anything, the family can all climb in the back. You get the use out of a car like that. Nope, nothing like a touring car." "Rank extravagance buying touring cars," put in another. "Horse and wagon is good enough for me." "That's what I say," agreed the fourth. "And what with taxes the way they are, and last year's crops wasn't any too good, I tell you, a touring car's the only thing nowadays." Somewhat astonished by the sudden turn the argument had taken, Frank vainly tried to make himself heard above the uproar. "But about this roadster?" he asked. "Did any of you see it?" But the 4 men in the field were not listening. Instead, they were deep in a highly complicated argument regarding the faults and merits of various makes of cars, and they paid no further attention to the youth. "Can't afford to waste any more time here," he said to himself, and turned away. At the fence he looked back. One of the farmhands was shaking his fist beneath the nose of a companion, while the other 2 were engrossed in a heated discussion. Their voices floated across the hayfield in the drowsy spring morning. "It looks as if you started something," laughed Joe as his brother returned to the motorcycle. "I certainly did. I just asked them if they'd seen a yellow roadster, and they started to fight about what was the best car for a farmer to buy." "And they didn't see the roadster?" asked Chet. "I don't think so. If they had, they would have told me. I guess they were glad of an excuse to quit work." "Well, we better get on our way then. We've lost enough time already." So while the 4 farmhands wrangled loudly in the field, in an argument that bade fair to last until dinner time at least, the 3 boys set out again in pursuit of the red-headed auto thief. They were approaching Bayport when they saw a girl walking along the road ahead of them. There was something familiar about her appearance, and as they drew nearer, Frank's face lighted up, for he recognized the girl as Callie Shaw, who was in his own class at Bayport High School. Of all of the girls at the school, Callie was the one most greatly admired by Frank. She was a pretty girl, with brown eyes and brown hair, always neatly dressed, and quick and vivacious in her manner. As the boys brought their motorcycles to a stop, Frank saw that Callie was not in her usual bright and cheery humor. Under one arm she was carrying a parcel that had evidently become untied, and the paper of which was badly torn. Her face was distressed, and it appeared that she had been crying. Callie looked up, and recognizing the boys, ran over toward them. "That awful man!" she wailed, even before they had time to ask her what the matter was. He ran right over my parcel and smashed nearly all the cakes and jelly I was bringing to Mrs. Wills." And with that, she held out the torn parcel. Frank knew that Callie, who was a generous and good-hearted girl, had been in the habit of taking little delicacies to a widow, Mrs. Wills, who lived just on the outskirts of Bayport. Now he saw that the parcel had been smashed, so that only one glass of jelly and a few of the cakes had been left intact. "What man, Callie?" he asked. "What happened?" "He ran right over my parcel." Just then Callie spied Chet Morton, and she pouted at him. "He was a friend of yours too, Chet Morton, for he was driving your car." "My car?" gasped Chet. "Your yellow roadster. He came driving along this road at such terrible speed that I was frightened, and I dropped my parcel. Then he ran right over it." "Why, Callie, that's just the fellow we've been looking for," said Frank quickly. "Chet's car has been stolen." "Well, whoever stole it came by here not 10 minutes ago," said the girl, "and he's a madman by the way he was driving." "Why, we're right on his tail then," declared Frank. "He must have gone into Bayport." "He was heading that way," Callie told them. "But at the rate he was going, you'll have a hard time catching him. Oh, Chet, I'm so sorry your car was stolen." "Don't worry, we'll get it back," replied Chet grimly. "Are you going back home, Callie?" asked Frank. "No, I'm going on up to Mrs. Will's place. You needn't bother to drive me up. It's only a few yards farther on. I know you're anxious to chase that awful man." "We'll chase him all right," declared Frank, as the motorcycles roared. They bade goodbye to the girl and sped on their way into Bayport, leaving Callie to continue her journey to the home of Mrs. Wills, with the remains of the cakes and jelly, over which she had spent so much time and care. They sped down the main street of Bayport and headed directly to the police station, where they intended to report the theft of Chet's car and a description of the thief, assuming him to be the red-headed man who had so nearly run down Frank and Joe on the shore road. But when they reached the police station, a further surprise was in wait for them. Chapter 4. The Hold-Up. Chief Ezra Collig, of the Bayport Police Force, was a burly, red-faced individual, much given to telling long-winded stories. Usually, Collig was to be found reclining in a swivel chair in his office, with his feet on the desk, reading the comic papers or polishing up his numerous badges. But this day something had happened to shake him out of his customary calm. When the boys went into his office, they found the chief painfully writing in a huge notebook and confronted by 3 excited figures. One of these was Ike Hardy, the old ticket seller at the city steamboat office. The others were Detective Smuff of the police force and Policeman Con Riley, both trying their best to look important and composed. Ike Hardy was frankly frightened. It was plain that something very much out of the ordinary had happened. Hardy was a timid and inoffensive old chap who had perched on a high stool behind the wicket at the steamboat office, day in, day out, for as many years as anyone in Bayport could remember. "I was just counting up the morning's receipts," he was saying, in a frightened and high-pitched voice, "when in comes this fellow, and he sticks a revolver in front of my nose." "Just a minute," interrupted the chief grandly, as the boys entered. He dipped his pen in the inkwell and poised it in the air, as he peered at the lads over his spectacles. "What are you boys doing here? Can't you see we're busy?" "I came to report a theft," said Chet Morton. "My roadster's been stolen." "Why, it was a roadster this fellow drove up to my office in," cried Ike Hardy. "A yellow roadster." "Ha!" said Detective Smuff. "A clue!" He immediately fished a notebook out of his pocket and began rummaging around for a pencil. "Never mind, Detective Smuff," observed the chief heavily. "I'll take any notes that are needed." Detective Smuff, duly squelched, put back his notebook in confusion. "What fellow?" Frank asked. "Who drove up to your office in a yellow roadster?" "The hold-up man! I was held up this morning. A fellow tried to steal the steamboat money on me." "Now, just a minute," demanded the chief. "Let me say a word here. The situation is this. A man drove up to the steamboat office a little while ago and tried to hold up Mr. Hardy. But a passenger happened to come into the office just then, and the fellow got frightened and ran away. Is that right?" "That's right," said Hardy. "I'll make a note of it," said the chief, suiting the action to the word. When he had scribbled industriously for some time, he raised the pen again and pointed it at Chet. "Now you," he observed, "say that somebody stole a yellow roadster on you this morning." "Yes, sir, from our farm. He was seen driving into Bayport just a little while ago." The chief made a note of it. "And you," he said, pointing the pen at Ike Hardy, "say the hold-up man drove up to the office in a yellow roadster." "That's right, Chief, that's right. A yellow roadster it was. And now that I come to think of it, I've seen Chet Morton's car before, and it was the spittin' image of it." "Then," declared the chief, putting down his pen, with the air of one making a momentous discovery, "it looks to me very much as if the hold-up man and the fellow that stole the car is one and the same man." Detective Smuff wagged his head solemnly in admiration of this feat of deduction. "I believe you're right, Chief," he declared. "Of course he's right," said Frank. "It couldn't be anyone else. The point is this. Where did the hold-up man go? Did he leave in the car? Did anyone follow him?" "He left in the car, all right," said Hardy, "but nobody followed him. I telephoned for the police." Did you notice the color of this man's hair?" asked Frank suddenly. "What's that got to do with it?" asked Detective Smuff. "Never mind. It may have a great deal to do with it. Did you notice the color of his hair?" repeated Frank, turning to Hardy. "It was short," said Hardy firmly. "Short and dark." Frank and Joe looked blankly at one another. "Are you sure?" asked Joe. "I'm positive," declared Hardy. "I was face to face with him. He was a dark-haired man and his hair was cut awful short. I noticed that." "You're sure he wasn't red-headed?" "I'm sure of it." "What's all this about?" asked Chief Collig suspiciously. "What has the color of his hair to do with it?" "Well," admitted Frank, "we were pretty sure that the man who stole Chet's car had long red hair." "Huh," muttered the chief doubtfully. "Then if that was the case, the man who stole the car and the man who tried to hold up the office isn't one and the same fellow after all." "I don't know what to make of it," confessed Frank. Just then a short, nervous little man was ushered into the office. He introduced himself as the passenger who had gone into the steamboat office at the time of the attempted hold-up, and he presented himself in answer to a call from the chief. In reply to questions, the newcomer, who gave the prosaic name of Henry J. Brown, and said he was from New York, told of entering the office and seeing a man run away from the wicket with a revolver in his hand. "What color was his hair, did you notice?" asked Frank eagerly. "I can't say that I did," answered the little man. "It all happened so quickly I didn't realize that it was a hold-up until the man was out the door. Then I saw him jump into the roadster and drive away. But, hey, wait a minute. I did notice the color of his hair, just as the car was disappearing down the street. You couldn't help but notice. He was red-headed. He had long red hair." Detective Smuff looked blankly at the chief, and the chief looked blankly at everybody else, particularly at Henry J. Brown of New York. "I knew it," declared Joe exultantly. "It's the same man." "It can't be the same man," said the chief wearily. "You boys don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Hardy said he had short dark hair. Now how could he have short dark hair and long red hair at the same time, I ask you that? How could he? Chief Colleague propounded this query with the expression of one who has triumphantly settled all difficulties. He had short, dark hair, said Hardy doggedly. And I'm sure he had long red hair, shouted Henry J. Brown very indignantly. Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I'd tell a lie about it? He had dark hair. It was red. It was dark. It wasn't. It was. Stop it, commanded Chief Colleague. I don't think either of you know what kind of hair he had. Probably he was bald-headed, but I'll send out word to keep a watch for the yellow roadster. I'll notify the police in other towns, too. I guess that's all that can be done now. And with that, the Hardy boys and Chet Morton had to be content. When they left the office, it was with little hope that the thief or the car would be found. Their misgivings were justified. When they returned to see Chief Colleague that night, they learned that no word had been received concerning the yellow roadster from any of the outlying towns or villages, and that despite a diligent search conducted by Detective Smuff and other members of the Bayport force, the roadster had not been located in the city. Chapter 5. Chet's Auto Horn. Fenton Hardy, the internationally famous detective, was reading in the library of his home that evening when his sons tapped on the door. Although he was a busy man, Mr. Hardy was not the type of father who maintains an air of aloofness from his family, the result being that he was on as good terms with his boys as though he were an elder brother. "Come in," he shouted cheerfully, putting aside his book. And when Frank and Joe entered the room, he motioned to a deep leather sofa near the window. "Sit down. What have you been doing all day? Burning up all the roads in the country, I suppose." He grinned amiably at them and puffed vigorously at his pipe. "Well, we didn't travel very far today, Dad," Frank replied. We were investigating," prompted Joe. "Aha!" exclaimed Mr. Hardy in mock surprise. "So my sons were investigating, eh? What was it? A murder? A plot to blow up the White House? A train wreck? Something big, I hope." "No, not quite that bad," admitted Frank. "It was a car theft." Mr. Hardy shook his head. "I'm disappointed in you," he said solemnly. "I really am. To think that sons of mine should investigate a car theft. I thought you wouldn't bother about anything less than a murder." His eyes twinkled, and the Hardy boys, who were accustomed to their father's good-natured banter, smiled back at him. "We weren't just practicing detective work, Dad," explained Frank. "You see, Chet Morton's roadster was stolen this morning." "Is that so?" exclaimed Mr. Hardy, genuinely concerned. "Why, that's too bad. Chet was mighty proud of that car, wasn't he?" "Yes, he was, and it hasn't been found yet." "No trace of the thief?" "He tried to hold up the steamboat ticket office after he stole the car." Mr. Hardy whistled. "Whew! Why, you have been on a case worthwhile. Tell me all about it." He settled back in his chair while his sons told him the story of the day's doings. When they told of the difference of opinion as to the color of the man's hair, he did not laugh with them as they had expected over the argument between Hardy and Mr. Brown. On the contrary, he knitted his brows, and his face wore a serious expression. "It wasn't any ordinary auto thief you were dealing with," he said slowly. "I've no doubt the man who tried to rob the ticket office and the man who almost ran you down on the shore road were one and the same, and the same man stole Chet Morton's car." "But how about the color of his hair? There must have been two men," said Joe. "You think so? I have my own theories. But then, the average witness is very unreliable. For instance, I'll give you a test. You've often seen Superintendent Norton of Bayport High School. Well, how often?" "Oh, about 2,000 or 3,000 times, I guess," answered Frank. "Over a period of 3 years. Well, what color is his hair?" Frank looked blankly at Joe. "Why, it's... Joe scratched his head. "Brown, isn't it? I think it's black." "You see," said Mr. Hardy, smiling, "your powers of observation have not been trained. A good detective has to school himself to remember all sorts of little facts like that, until it gets to be a habit with him. Both of you have been looking at Mr. Norton for about 3 years, and you don't know the color of his hair. And if I asked you whether he was in the habit of wearing laced shoes or buttoned shoes, you would be stumped altogether. As a matter of fact, Mr. Norton is bald, and he wears a chestnut wig. You never noticed that? He always wears buttoned shoes. He belongs to the Elks Club, and his favorite author is Dickens." The boys looked at their father in amazement. "But, Dad, you've never met him." "I've never been introduced to him, but I've passed him on the street a number of times. When your powers of observation have been trained as mine have been, it's no trick at all to take away a mental photograph of a man after seeing him once. If you're specially observant, it isn't hard to notice such details as that regarding the wig. A wig never has the same appearance as natural hair." "But how do you know he belongs to the Elks?" asked Joe. "He wears the lodge emblem as a watch charm." And how do you know his favorite author is Dickens?" "On 3 separate occasions that I met Mr. Norton, I noticed that he was carrying a book. Once it was Oliver Twist. Another time it was A Tale of Two Cities. The third time it was David Copperfield. So I judged that his favorite author must be Dickens. Am I right?" "He always talks Dickens to us at school." "It's simple enough once you get the habit," remarked Mr. Hardy. "You must train yourselves to be observant, so that in time you will automatically remember little details about people you meet and places you visited. Now, if Harity and Mr. Brown had been at all observant, in spite of the fact that they were surprised and frightened, they would have been able to give the police a very thorough description of the man who tried to hold up the steamboat office. And if the man happened to be a professional thief, the description would have helped the officers ascertain who he was, because once a man has served a prison term, his description is kept on file. As it is, all we know about him is that he is probably red-headed. That isn't very much to go on." "I'm afraid Chet hasn't much chance of recovering his roadster," said Joe. "Oh, you never can tell," remarked his father. "It may turn up sometime. Perhaps the thief will get himself into trouble yet. Keep your eyes and your ears open. And now, if you don't mind, I have some reports to write." Frank and Joe took the hint and left their father to his work. But although they talked long into the night on possible ways and means of recovering Chet's car, they were able to devise no plan for tracing the thief. And through the week that followed, there were no further clues. Chet had given up all hope of seeing the roadster again. "I sure missed the old bus," he told the Hardy boys after school on Friday afternoon. "I have to take my chances on catching rides in and out of town now. Why, last night I walked halfway home before a car came along and gave me a lift. Saturday will be a pretty dull day for you now." "You just bet your sweet life it will be dull. Nothing to do but sit around the farm." "Better come with us tomorrow," suggested Joe. "A bunch of us are going fishing up near the dam. You can meet us at the crossroads near Willow River." "Good idea," said Chet. "What time?" 10 o'clock. "Fine. I'll be there. Gosh, I see where I get a ride home. There goes a hay wagon, and it's heading right for the next farm." A long wagon rumbled slowly toward the boys. A lean and solemn farmer perched on the front seat, half asleep. The horses dawdled along. "That's Lem Billers, the laziest man in 9 counties," said Chet. "Watch me have some fun with him." Chet took from his pocket an automobile horn. He had originally bought it for the roadster, but had not yet had time to install it before the car was stolen. The horn was of a new type, very small, yet it had a particularly raucous shriek. The Hardy boys grinned as they saw Chet step out into the road and swing himself lightly up onto the back of the wagon. Mr. Billers was bringing some supplies back to the farm, and Chet was hidden from view by a bag of flour. As the wagon rumbled past, Chet sounded the automobile horn. It shrieked sharply and insistently. Mr. Billers, being a lazy man, did not even look behind. He simply tugged lightly at the reins, and the horses edged over to the side of the road. Having heard the horn, Mr. Billers expected an automobile would pass, but when no car flashed by, he turned indolently in his seat and looked behind. The roadway was clear. There was not an automobile in sight. He did not see Chet, doubling up with laughter on the back of the wagon. He gazed doubtfully at the Hardy boys, who were standing at the curb, trying to conceal their smiles. "Could have swore I heard a horn," grunted Mr. Billers. Then he tugged at the lines and brought the horses into the middle of the road again. Instantly the horn shrieked again. This time it was even louder and more insistent than before. It seemed that an automobile was right behind the wagon, clamoring to pass. Almost automatically, Mr. Billers yanked at the reins, and the horses again went to the side of the road. But again, no car went past. Again Mr. Billers looked behind him. Again, to his astonishment, he saw that the roadway was clear. "Hanged if I didn't think I heard a horn," exclaimed Mr. Billers, greatly puzzled, as he drove on again. "My ears must be going back on me." But in a few minutes the horn shrieked again. Frank and Joe, who were walking along the sidewalk, keeping abreast of the wagon so as not to miss the fun, chuckled as they saw Mr. Billers once more pull on the reins to guide the horses to the roadside. Then the farmer recollected how he had been fooled on the previous occasions, and he looked quickly around. Again, there was no car in sight. Mr. Billers gazed down the roadway for a long time. Then he sighed, with the air of one whose patience has been long tried. "Must be something the matter with my ears," he muttered and drove on. At this moment, a luxurious sedan swept around a corner and drew up close behind the wagon. There was a chauffeur at the wheel, and he sounded his horn impatiently, for the road was narrow, and he was unable to get past. Lem Billers smiled darkly to himself and paid no attention. "There it goes again," he grumbled. "I must be hearing things. Hang me if I'll turn out any more when there ain't no car there to turn out for." The wagon continued in the center of the road. The chauffeur of the car glared at Lem Billers' back and sounded the horn again. Still the farmer paid no attention. Chet, limp with laughter, almost rolled off the wagon. Frank and Joe could control their mirth no longer and leaned against a telephone post with shouts of glee. The chauffeur, believing that the boys were laughing at him because he could not get past, became purple with anger. He sounded the horn again and again, and finally, when Lem Billers obstinately refused to pay any attention, he looked wildly about for a policeman. As luck would have it, Constable Con Riley was ambling along Main Street at that moment, wondering if it would soon be supper time, and hoping his wife would serve corned beef and cabbage that evening. He was aroused from his trance by the chauffeur, who brought the sedan to a stop and ran over to him. "Officer, arrest that man!" roared the chauffeur, pointing to Lem Billers. "What for?" demanded Con, taking off his helmet and scratching his head. "Obstructing the traffic. He won't let me pass. I've been sounding my horn for the last 5 minutes, and he won't let me go by." "Oh ho!" said Constable Riley. "He can't get away with that. Not while Con Riley's on the beat." And with that he ran out into the road, shouting to Lem Billers to stop. At the constable's command, the farmer halted his team and gazed in amazement at the chauffeur and the officer as they came running up to him. "Why won't you let him pass?" demanded the constable. "Don't say you didn't hear me," roared the chauffeur. "I sounded my horn 50 times." "Sure, I heard a horn," admitted Billers. "But," he added triumphantly, "I didn't see no car." "Are you blind?" asked Riley. "There's the car." Lem Billers looked behind. At the sight of the sedan, his jaw dropped. "Well, I'll be hanged," he declared sadly. "It must be my eyes as going back on me, not my ears. I looked behind 3 times and I couldn't see no car." "Don't believe him, officer," said the chauffeur. "He didn't even turn around." "I did so," contended Mr. Billers. "Then why didn't you let me pass?" "You didn't have no car. I heard a horn, but I didn't see no car." Thereupon the argument grew fast and furious. Constable Riley was vastly puzzled. He didn't know what to make of it. Both the chauffeur and Lem Billers appeared to be telling the truth. Yet there was something wrong somewhere. He took it all down in a notebook, while Mr. Billers and the chauffeur grew angrier and angrier at each other, until finally they were on the point of settling the matter with their fists. In the meantime, there was a steadily lengthening line of cars and wagons blocking the street, unable to get past because of the hay wagon and the sedan. A constant chorus of automobile horns sounded. Angry drivers roared at the officer to clear the road. Constable Riley threw up his hands in disgust. "Get on your way, both of you," he commanded. "I can't stand here arguing all afternoon." And while Lem Billers, wondering whether his eyes or his ears had deceived him, drew his horses to the side of the road and muttered strong threats of vengeance against the chauffeur, the traffic tangle gradually abated. When he finally resumed his journey, the Hardy Boys could see Chet Morton lying limply in the back of the wagon, with tears of laughter running down his face. As for Frank and Joe, they laughed all the way home, and during supper that evening, their spasmodic outbursts of chuckles puzzled their parents extremely. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to the adventures of the Hardy Boys in The Tower Treasure. I'd love to hear from you, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.